Then, thud. Silence. Another thud. Dust falls from the wooden beams of a tiny underground tunnel. A man's hand reaches forward through the darkness. He is crawling on his stomach. There is barely enough room to breathe. His uniform is covered in dirt. His face is scratched. But he keeps moving. Because somewhere above him, German guards are walking. And somewhere behind him, hundreds of prisoners are waiting for their turn. This isn't a movie. It isn't a legend. It happened. March 24, 1944. Inside a German prisoner of war camp called Stalag Luft III, dozens of Allied airmen are preparing to do something that should be impossible. They are going to escape from one of the most heavily guarded prison camps in Nazi Germany. Not one man, not 10, not even 50, more than 200 men. They have spent nearly a year digging 3 enormous tunnels beneath the camp. They named them Tom, Dick, Harry. One tunnel has been discovered. Another has been deliberately hidden. And tonight, Harry is finally ready. But there is one problem. The tunnel does not come out where they planned. It ends 76 yards short of the forest. And outside that tunnel, Germany is waiting. The first man climbs out, then another, then another. For a few precious minutes, the greatest escape attempt of the Second World War appears to be succeeding. Until a guard looks into the darkness and notices something. Something that shouldn't be there. A footprint. And suddenly, the escape becomes a race against time. To understand the Great Escape, you have to understand the men inside the camp. They were pilots, navigators, radio operators, bombardiers, young men who had flown over Nazi-occupied Europe and survived missions that many others never returned from. But surviving a plane crash didn't mean freedom. If their aircraft was shot down, they became prisoners of war. And for many Allied airmen, that meant being sent to a German POW camp. One of those camps was Stalag Luft III. It was located near Sagan, in what was then German territory, and is now Zagan, Poland. The camp was specifically designed to hold captured Allied airmen, and the Germans had learned something important. Airmen were dangerous prisoners, not because they could fight, but because they could escape. So Stalag Luft III was designed to make escape extraordinarily difficult. The barracks were raised above the ground. The surrounding soil was pale and sandy. The buildings were positioned carefully. Guards watched from towers. Searchlights swept the compound at night. And underneath everything, there was another layer of defense. The Germans had buried microphones around the camp. Their purpose was simple: listen for digging. The prisoners knew this. The guards knew this. Everyone knew that getting out would be extremely difficult. But there was one thing the Germans underestimated. The prisoners were not simply waiting for the war to end. They were planning. Inside Stalag Luft III, escape was almost an institution. There was an organized escape committee. Men collected maps, fake documents,
civilian clothes, compasses, food, money, tools, anything that could help a prisoner disappear once he crossed the camp's perimeter. But perhaps the most important man in the entire operation was a British officer named Roger Bushell. His fellow prisoners called him Big X.
Bushell had been captured after being shot down during the Battle of France in 1940. He had escaped from captivity before, and he intended to do it again. But Bushell understood something. One tunnel could be discovered. One escape route could collapse. One careless prisoner could expose everything. So he proposed something much more ambitious. They would dig 3 tunnels at once. If one was discovered, another would remain. And if the Germans discovered the second,
the third might still work. The tunnels were given names: Tom, Dick, Harry. The names sounded almost ridiculous, but beneath that harmless humor was a serious plan. They were going to wage a war underground. The problem wasn't simply digging. The problem was hiding the evidence. Imagine removing tons of soil inside a prison camp without the guards noticing. Every shovel of dirt could expose the plan. Every sound could give them away. Every careless movement could mean death. So the prisoners developed an ingenious system. They dug beneath the floor of a barracks. The tunnel entrances were hidden beneath removable floorboards. But the real challenge was the soil. The camp sat on sandy ground. The Germans had deliberately chosen the location, partly because the soil made tunneling easier to detect. The prisoners found a way to turn that weakness into an advantage. They discovered that the sand beneath the surface was a different color from the sand around the camp. If they simply dumped it outside, the guards might notice. So they developed a system for secretly scattering it. Some prisoners carried small bags of sand beneath their trousers. Others released it gradually while walking. They became known as penguins. They would walk around the camp, apparently doing nothing, while secretly releasing tiny quantities of soil. Step by step, day after day, the camp was slowly being moved from underneath the guards' noses. But digging a tunnel was only the beginning. They also needed air. They needed lighting. They needed supports. They needed tools. And they needed all of it, without anyone discovering what they were doing. The tunnels were extraordinary. They were narrow. Some sections were only around 2 feet wide. Prisoners worked lying down. They used crude tools, shovels, knives, improvised digging equipment. Even tin cans were transformed into tools. The deeper they went, they used electric lights connected to the camp's electrical supply. And the deeper the tunnel became, the more difficult it was to breathe. Imagine spending hours underground, in a space barely wide enough to turn around, knowing that if the ceiling collapsed, nobody might know where you were. But they kept digging, because every inch brought them closer to freedom, and every inch also brought them closer to discovery.
The prisoners had 3 tunnels, but they didn't finish all 3. They couldn't. Eventually, the Germans discovered Tom. It happened in August 1943. The tunnel was exposed. The escape committee was devastated. But there was another reason this mattered. The prisoners realized that the Germans were becoming increasingly suspicious. They knew they had to work faster. The second tunnel, Dick, was eventually abandoned because its intended exit area had become unsuitable. But the prisoners had planned for failure. There was still one tunnel left. Harry. And Harry would become famous.
Roger Bushell understood that escaping was not enough. The men had to survive once they got outside. So the escape plan included something extraordinary. They would not simply run. They would disguise themselves. Some would dress as civilians. Some would pretend to be foreign workers. Some would carry forged documents. Others would attempt to travel by train. They would split into small groups. The goal was to create confusion. If the Germans captured one group, others might still get away. Bushell wanted as many men as possible to have a chance. The plan was ambitious.
Perhaps too ambitious. Because the more people involved, the greater the chance that something would go wrong. And eventually, something did. The night had arrived. The prisoners prepared themselves. Clothing was ready. Documents were ready. Compasses were ready. Maps were ready. Food was prepared. Some men had civilian coats. Others had uniforms designed to make them appear less suspicious. Then they opened Harry. The tunnel entrance was revealed. One man entered. Then another. Then another. The escape had begun. Inside the tunnel, the men crawled forward. Slowly. Silently. One after another. But there was a problem. The tunnel had been intended to emerge near the forest. Instead, it came up short. The men climbed out and found themselves in the open. They were not hidden by trees. They were exposed. Every second mattered. But there was no turning back. The first prisoners crawled out. They looked around. Nothing. For a moment, the impossible seemed possible. A man who had spent months behind barbed wire was standing outside the camp. Free. Then another emerged, and another. The escapees began moving toward the woods, but because the tunnel ended short of the forest, they couldn't simply disappear. They had to crawl through the snow-covered ground. Every movement was dangerous. The prisoners had expected darkness to protect them, but the moonlight made them visible. Then, a guard discovered the tunnel. The alarm was raised. Searchlights came on. Dogs were released. Guards began searching the surrounding area. The escape was exposed. But the prisoners kept running. More than 200 prisoners had intended to escape, but the alarm changed everything. Only 76 men managed to get out of the camp before the Germans stopped the escape. 76 men. That's still an astonishing number. Imagine 76 enemy airmen suddenly moving through Nazi Germany with no army behind them, no safe houses guaranteed, no modern communication, no GPS, no smartphones, no reliable way to know where the German patrols were. Just maps, compasses, false identities, and hope. Some headed toward railway stations. Some moved through forests. Some tried to reach neutral countries. Some attempted to travel south. Others went west. They were now fugitives, and the entire German state was searching for them.
The escape triggered a massive manhunt. Roads were watched. Railways were monitored. Police were alerted. Border crossings were tightened. The Germans wanted the prisoners back. But there was something else at stake. Hitler had been informed of the escape, and according to post-war accounts, he demanded severe punishment for those who were recaptured. The escapees were no longer simply prisoners. They had embarrassed the German security system, and the Nazi leadership wanted revenge. One by one, the escapees were caught. Some were discovered hiding. Some were stopped on trains. Some were betrayed. Some were simply unlucky. But a few continued moving, and a handful came remarkably close to freedom.
Eventually, the Great Escape was crushed. Of the 76 men who escaped from the camp, 73 were eventually recaptured. And of those 73, 50 were murdered by the Germans. The killings were carried out despite the prisoners being protected as prisoners of war under international law. The murdered men were falsely presented as having been killed while resisting recapture. The truth was far darker. The men had escaped. They had been captured. And then they were executed. Among those murdered was Roger Bushell, the man known as Big X, the architect of the escape, the man who had planned the impossible.
The man who had believed that freedom was worth risking everything for. Only 3 of the 76 escapees successfully reached safety. One of them was Norwegian. 2 were Dutch. Their escape routes eventually took them toward neutral Sweden. They had survived. But 50 of their comrades were dead.
The Great Escape failed, if you measure success only by the number of men who reached freedom. But history remembers it for another reason, because those prisoners did something extraordinary. They refused to accept captivity as their final fate. They knew the odds. They knew the risks. They knew what would happen if they were caught. And still, they dug. They planned. They forged documents. They built tools. They created disguises. They crawled through darkness for a chance to see the outside world again. The Great Escape wasn't simply about leaving a prison camp. It was about refusing to surrender psychologically. The Germans could lock their bodies behind barbed wire, but they could not convince them that they were no longer free
Human beings. Roger Bushell never made it home. Neither did the other 49 men murdered after the escape. But their story survived. Decades later, the tunnel they built became one of the most famous escape tunnels in military history. The camp itself disappeared. The war ended. The Nazi regime collapsed. And the world moved on. But beneath the earth, the remains of Harry still tell the story. A tunnel dug by prisoners, with crude tools, under constant surveillance, through darkness, for freedom.
Think about that. These men had no certainty that the tunnel would work. They didn't know whether they would survive the journey. They didn't know whether they would ever see their families again. But they dug anyway. Because sometimes the greatest act of resistance isn't winning a battle. It's refusing to believe that you have already lost. On the night of March 24, 1944, 76 men walked out of a German prison camp. Only 3 reached freedom. 50 were murdered. And yet,
The escape is still remembered as one of the most audacious prison breaks in history. Because for one night, inside the heart of Nazi Germany, a group of prisoners turned a prison into a construction site. They turned sand into a weapon. They turned darkness into a pathway. And they turned hope into an escape. They called the tunnel Harry. And for one unforgettable night, Harry led them toward freedom.
if you enjoyed this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries, subscribe for more forgotten civilizations, unsolved disappearances, lost empires, and unbelievable true stories from the past. And tell us in the comments